Welcome to Say It So They Get It, the podcast where we help business owners and professionals clearly explain what they do, who they help, and what makes them different. Because when people understand your message, they are much more likely to trust you, work with you, and refer you to someone else. Korey Bowlby is a financial advisor with Edward Jones, a former Tucson police officer and a member of the United States Army Reserve. Korey has spent much of his life serving others. Today, he continues that service by helping military members, veterans, first responders, and their families make informed decisions about their financial futures. That background matters because these communities often have financial benefits, retirement systems, pensions, and career transitions that can be difficult for someone outside of that world to understand. Korey, welcome to Say It So They Get It.
Thanks, Sean.
I want to begin with kind of some of your background. We talked about a little bit, what originally led you to the Army?
Yeah. So I actually had an interest in joining the military around high school age. And I initially was looking at going to do ROTC in college. I eventually decided that was not the right fit for me. I moved on and became a law enforcement officer after that. And even doing that and serving community, I still always felt this drive to want to be in the military. It just kind of felt like a calling in a way. I know that's kind of cliche, but I just always felt like it was there. And I had an opportunity presented to me several years ago to join. And even though I was a little bit older and a little bit later in life, I figured if not now, then never. And decided that I needed to go do it for myself.
Awesome. So you talked about law enforcement. You were with Tucson Police Department, right?
I was. Yeah, that's where I started my career.
And when did you start that? And what assignments did you have?
So I started with Tucson PD back in 2011. At the time, I was living in North Carolina and decided to move across the country kind of on a whim. Moved out to Arizona in the middle of July, started the police academy. I said, this is a great time to move to Arizona because the weather is perfect to be in the academy. So, and I
wait. So July was the academy time?
Yes.
Oh my
July.
goodness.
Yeah.
Well,
it was perfect.
I think I started late. I think I was the fourth class of the year. And so we started in the fall, but man, I could not imagine doing some of that stuff in the summer. Where was your academy at? Was it Siletzi?
It was Siletzi. Yep.
Yeah. So towers in the summertime is not what I think I would remember. So,
well, I do remember it.
Yeah. Okay. So, what'd you enjoy most about serving as a police officer?
So, for me, I ended up doing a couple different things in law enforcement. I worked as a police officer. I eventually moved into the federal side as an investigator. But when I look back at that career, I loved being a police officer. I loved being on patrol. I think there's something to be said about having an immediate impact on someone else's life pretty much every day that you're at work. And I don't know that there's really any other career field where you can do that and have that much of an impact. Maybe people don't see that every day, but I felt like every day you had an opportunity to impact somebody's life and hopefully for the better.
Sure. I used to say that quite a bit when I was working for the sheriff's department. People are like, why become a deputy? Why did you do it? And same kind of thing. Like you have an opportunity, a chance to make a positive effect on somebody's life. And you're right. It's every day in patrol. I mean, certainly there's other disciplines and other fields within the, sheriff's department or police department where you can do that. But, patrol is, heck, you could take 10, 15 calls and you have the ability to impact or potentially impact 15 people in a day.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I don't really think there is any other job that you have that kind of impact, especially immediately. And I think like having done investigations as well, there's an opportunity to do some great stuff there. But usually that takes longer and it's a longer time frame before you actually see a result. And I think just being in patrol, like you're there with people, they see you, they know exactly what, is going to happen right then and there. And you just have that immediate impact. And I always like that. I appreciated being able to kind of be in the mix of things and know that I was doing something positive.
Well, I think the one thing I really enjoyed about patrol versus being a detective was your call ended that day. Like, you were talking about, the impact, taking longer as a detective because some cases could take months or years to get some closure. And I felt like my mind was kind of working those a lot. And patrol was, okay, I'm done for the day. And now I'm 10/7 and I'm done for the day. So
yeah, you could just get a clean slate and just kind of move on.
Yeah. So was there a particular turning point that led you towards the financial planning? You want to talk about that?
Sure. When I was younger and early in my career, I kind of like to tell some stories where I wasn't the best with money. And I ended up meeting a financial advisor when in my early 20s. And he actually kind of gave me a decent setup and things to think about. I didn't really care all that much, at 22, 23, but eventually I started to dive into a lot of things on my own. And over the next decade plus of time, like I got really into personal finance, really into investing and planning as a whole. And I had been approached at one point by my second financial advisor who's like, "Hey, you should consider doing this." And I was like, "Nah, I don't think so. Maybe one day, but not right now. There's still a lot of stuff I want to do in law enforcement." At a certain point, I kind of felt like I hit, all those boxes where I had done pretty much everything I wanted to do. I had some really great experiences and also some negative ones as well. And I also found myself kind of spending a lot of time away from my family. And so when I started to balance the good with the bad, I felt like I needed to make a change personally. And when I took a step back, there was definitely a lot of concern over, hey, are my skills from law enforcement going to translate into anything outside of like corporate security? I was
Right.
where it's at
Right.
because that's what everybody does. You
Mhm.
leave your police job and you go into corporate security and, you just do your thing. And I didn't necessarily want to do that. And I ran into some issues where that didn't happen. And I started talking to some folks that I met on LinkedIn who left law enforcement and went into a wide array of stuff that I had never thought about. And I kind of internalized that and realized like, wow, maybe this is a perfect time for me to step away and to actually do something that I enjoy, which would be financial planning, and to go into, still being able to work with people and help people, but in a different capacity.
Sure. Well, and that experience, and I've heard you talk a few different times, but that experience lends towards kind of where I want to focus on with this is the military guys, the veterans, police officers, firefighters, first responders, because you understand that world and you were there and you understand the benefits of being there. And I think that's kind of where I want to take this now. So with your background, you are set up differently than a regular financial advisor. I don't know if that's a thing, but that to me is a specialized area where me as prior in law enforcement, as retired military, I can come to you, say things to you, and the nomenclature makes sense and you understand and you're able to reflect that back. So is that one of your main focuses then is being able to serve those people?
It is. And I think a lot of it does have to do with what you just said. Coming from those fields, having that background, I think it's different. Like, yes, there are people out there who are going to understand the same things and be able to pick up on that. But, the way I look at it is I didn't just learn it through reading a textbook or kind of going through and, scouring web pages. Like I lived through those experiences. I know what it's like to be in that position to wear those uniforms, but I also know what the benefits are like and what that looks like. I do think it's a little bit easier to talk to somebody and sit down and have that conversation where you don't necessarily have to explain to me what PSPRS is, right? I understand that. I've been there. I know how it works. And I think that makes it a little bit easier for both of us. And it's a lot less, I think, explanation and trying to get through the difficulties and some of the struggles and challenges that, you're going to go through in your particular career field.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned PSPRS, that's, the public safety retirement for the state, which is the pension, right? That's what everybody works for. And I'm not even sure now, and I'm sure you've got way better touch on this, but when I started, it was 20 years. And let's go back to the young Korey that, became a police officer and your idea of what that pension was going to be, and talk about the reality, if you don't mind, of what it really means today.
Yeah, I think when I first started, same thing. I entered into PSPRS before they changed everything. And so I was in tier one, looking at 20 years of work and 50% pension. And that sounded great. I also didn't really know what any of that meant at the time. It was just more or less like, okay, cool. I can work for 20 years and I know that you're going to pay me when I leave. That sounds like a good deal. Why not? And I think there's some comfort in that. And in some way, it goes back to almost being complacent. One of the things we're trying to avoid in our job is that complacency. And yet sometimes we take that into our financial lives. Pensions, the way I look at them, it's a floor, right? the amount of money you're going to get when you retire. You can do the calculation to figure that out. And yes, some of the calculations are a little bit more complex than others, but you have an idea of what you're going to make when you hit that certain time frame. But I think what we miss out on a lot of times is you look back and you say, hey, I was making $100,000 before I retired. I know I'm going to walk away making 50%. And sure, some of my expenses will go down. Some of the other things I was paying for will decrease. I'm not contributing to the pension anymore or deferred compensation, but there's still a gap. And that gap is probably not something that you've really thought too much about. And I know that I hadn't. And I think there's other parts of that too, where you look at, myself, for example, I didn't necessarily stick around long enough to receive an immediate pension. So, what about those timeframes where you might change jobs or switch out or unfortunately get hurt and are forced out? Those all play a role in, what benefits you have available to you as well.
Yeah. And so I can absolutely relate to this 100%. I started the academy at 35, had a different career before that. But my thought was exactly that. 20 years, they're going to keep paying me. It's 50%. But I never really put the numbers to what that equates to now. And I'm going to tell you, the floor is probably a good analogy that I've heard for that, because that's really all it is. I can be honest and say, there's no way I could live off of that. And 20 something years ago, I guess I thought I could, but I never looked into it. So having a conversation with you about what that's going to look like and a clear picture of it, because you can pretty much get a good range of where that's going to be for them. And then you mentioned deferred comp, which, the deferred compensation plans, which can help contribute to that. But again, a regular guy, somebody's going to show up, you sign up for deferred comp, you pick your plan, and then you watch your money, with the ebbs and flows. But to me, that's, I think, where you're going to be able to really provide that. So if I know somebody that's getting started in this, or somebody has a family member, that's a great time for you to have a conversation. Would you say so?
Absolutely. I feel like, just based on personal experience with myself, but also talking to other people, the earlier you take a look at this and actually think about what it means, the easier it is to not just plan for, but to make it a reality. And in some instances, it actually might require less work up front than it will if you're trying to fix things or make things happen on the tail end of your career.
So what mistakes do you see people make when they treat their pension as the entire strategy? We talked a little bit about that, but in that process, let's be honest, most guys and women go in their mid-20s, maybe in their 30s. So when they get out, they're still of working age. So kind of where would you talk to somebody about that? Let's talk about the pension, the PSPRS, and then really kind of some planning after that. Would that be a picture you could help somebody maybe mid-career to start to paint that picture so they're prepping for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, one of the things that we tend to see is you look at the pension as being your entire strategy, and you don't end up planning in any other capacity outside of that. So maybe you don't do deferred compensation at all, or you just do a minimum amount and you never think about it. And the other part of that deferred compensation aspect is what are you actually investing in? If you're just putting money into an account and you didn't do anything with it, that's an issue as well. But specifically on the pension piece, I think it's easy when you first start. Like you say, for yourself, you look back to when you started and you do 20 some odd years. When you first start that career and you look in the future, who knows what's actually going to change in your life? Maybe you aren't married at that time. Maybe you end up having a family. You buy a new house, you buy new cars, whatever the case may be. Your life and your lifestyle will change over time. And I think if you really start to consider where you're at on day one and where you're at 20 to 25 years later, it's going to be different. And if all you've done up to that point is relied on what is going into the pension, you might be pretty disappointed when you walk away and you go, no, my lifestyle is up here and I only plan for, down here. I think that gets to be one of the harder parts. And so I think one thing to think about and to think through this is that, yes, it's easier, I should say, to start thinking about this at an earlier age and early in your career. But even mid-career and as you get closer to it, there are still things that you can do to try and pad your accounts and start planning for what that next phase looks like. I would say like one of
Mhm.
the biggest things though is you get to that point where maybe when you first start, you said, I'm going to do 20 or 25 years and I'm never going to work again. And the pension is just going to cover everything. And then you get to that point where you're like 5 years out and you're like, well, I don't know if that's actually going to happen. Maybe I should stick around for another 5 years to make this work, or I'm going to have to get another job to cover the expenses or to cover healthcare, which is something that
Right.
we don't talk about a lot. Is, what are your healthcare costs going to be when you walk away? I think that
Yeah.
that's where a
And
lot of this comes to play.
yeah. And so I agree, having retired within the last 5 years, we talked in the beginning of this about people going to corporate security. And a lot of people, when they get close to the end, now it's, well, maybe I'll stay 5 more years. Maybe I'll go into the drop. Maybe I'll do those things that extend what I'm doing, and almost as a safety net or a life preserver to keep them afloat until they can create a plan, which at that point they still have options to do that. But I think the big one that I see in a lot of my friends that have retired is that healthcare element, right? We don't get healthcare when we leave. And, healthcare is not cheap. I saw a podcast the other day where somebody was talking about it, and they basically said in the United States, healthcare, if you pay out of pocket, is the same as a mortgage payment. And most people don't expect that when they get there. So, I remember when I was getting ready to get out, that started to become like a big thing. And then it was like, and I don't want to carry a gun anymore. I don't want to have to do this. I want to do something different. But you have people that that have transitioned into other careers, and, hey, the benefits, it's always the benefits. And I'll be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I did the reserve, but that doesn't even kick in until I'm 60, which fortunately I am now. But, that was kind of that gap where I see a lot of these people looking at their Medicare doesn't start for another 5 years for some of these guys. So is that part of what you would talk to somebody about when they set up a meeting with you, to kind of be like, hey, let's look at big picture. We're not just talking about money, but let's talk about what other expense stuff that you're going to find.
Yeah. The way I usually work with people is, first, let's take a look at where you are right now. I think that that's one of the things that a lot of people don't have much of an idea on. Sometimes we have maybe a faint thought or concept of kind of where we're sitting, but let's focus on where you are right now. Let's focus on where you want to go. We'll talk about what it's going to take to get there. But yes, there are, I think, a number of other ancillary topics that we have to talk about, and healthcare is one of them. And some of the others are going to be different types of insurances and maybe legacy planning or estate planning and things like that, you might not think of on your own. And I think that that's kind of one of the benefits of being able to talk to somebody about this, is that you start to see things and hear things that maybe you're not aware of or thinking about, because you're focused on, I want to retire. I just need to figure out how to get there.
And retire the way we dreamt about when we started, right? I mean, I'll be
Right.
honest. My vision was, I'm going to go fishing every day, or I'm going to go do this. And the reality is that it just doesn't happen unless you have everything planned. And, I'm the first to admit it. I certainly didn't. I thought, reserve retirement and, my pension, and, it just wasn't there. I had to, I started a business after all that until everything else kicked in. But I know we've talked a lot about the police and first responders, but let's talk a little bit about the military side, because that's a little bit different. There's two paths to retirement. So tell me a little bit about somebody that's in active duty. They're approaching 20, 25 years, and kind of what would you talk to them or look to have them look at with you?
I think in some ways it's very similar, but there are also some differences there. And namely, part of that comes out to, whether or not you're going to be eligible for VA benefits on top of your pension. Are you going to receive VA healthcare, which, completely changes depending on your view of the VA and whether or not you plan to use it. But if it's available to you, and if you have that changes the game in terms of, some of the expenses that you could potentially be looking at. And that kind of opens you up too to, start to explore other options for second career, or whatever it may be that you decide to do when you step away. I think part of that also comes with folks that don't retire from the military, people who again are separating, but may still have a disability rating that, allows them to get certain things that, that can help. And it provides at least a cushion in some fashion that, you might not otherwise have. But you still have a lot of the same issues that you're going to want to plan for. And you're right, like depending on where we're at right now, you've also got folks that are either in the legacy retirement system or the blended retirement system, and kind of some of those differences. Because there's a little bit that could be different in terms of how you plan with each one of those based on what you expect to get at the end of your career.
Sure. Let's stay on the topic of active duty. What would you tell a service member who is 5 to 10 years out? What kind of things would you talk to them about in this prep, right? They know in 5 years I'm out. And honestly, we've heard that forever. I mean, when I went to drill when I was on active duty, you'd have those people like, this is it. My last day's here. And and then they get to the end and they start getting a little nervous. But, somebody that is realistically thinking, 5 or 10 years, what's something you might have them start focusing on at that point?
I think part of it is ensuring that, your records are correct. One thing that we all know is that government is not always correct, especially when it comes to paperwork. So prior to, submitting your packet and going through that process, you need to go through on your own and double check to make sure that everything is valid and correct, and that whatever you're trying to document along the way is also taken care of. Otherwise, you risk running into issues or having to delay when you can actually retire because you're working on trying to get things fixed.
So that conversation would probably be a good just kind of prep of, hey, look, are you going to be ready? Here's what you need to have. And you would be somebody that would be able to help them at least identify that and get things set up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I actually have a couple different checklists specifically for military members that are planning on retiring or separating that they can go through of things that, they need to be aware of. And it goes beyond just the financial stuff, but different things that you're going to want to think through prior to, hitting submit, right? Here's some different things to think about, and here's some things that we can talk about so that you're actually prepared for that day.
And again, I think that's the key to when people start talking about, I'm going to talk to a financial advisor, and why it's so important to talk to you, because you have that knowledge. Again, you're not just going to say, well, we'll invest your pension in X and Y, whatever funds that we're going to do. It's your complete knowledge of their journey and helping them to prep. That to me sets you apart from anybody else that's going to talk to them about, and I don't mean to just say a regular financial advisor, but really that's kind of the difference, right? You've got such a unique background to help these people. And we've talked first responders, we've talked active duty, and for that. And so the planning is, like you just said, it's not just financial, right? You've got so many more tools that will give them a broader picture of their path.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing that I kind of learned, through my own journey too, was that I looked at everything kind of in an individual silo. And I think that when you do that, you run the risk of missing things, especially if it's just your eyes looking at it. I think between going through it on my own and working with other people as they're navigating these different, career changes and retirement situations, I'm able to pick up on a lot of that stuff that carries over from person to person. And so it's a little bit easier to see, hey, here are some of the things that you should consider. Here's some of the gaps. Let's talk through this. And again, just understanding kind of what that actually looks like, I think does make it a little easier.
Sure. So we talked active duty. Let's talk reserve. And for those people that maybe don't understand, reserve retirement is one of the strangest things that you try to figure out, even as the service member, right?
Yes.
You get a percentage of up to a certain percentage based on the points. And so is that something a reservist can come to you and say, listen, here's where I'm at. I'm at year 5 or I'm at year 15. Are you able to help them look at their records, the point capture sheets? And then really, because you kind of hit it too. A lot of these people think, well, when I get to 20, I'm going to be done. But they don't go into, like for us, it's their bupers and look at where the good years are and what that means to retirement. So talk a little bit about where you could help a reservist, full-time job somewhere else, but in the reserves, because that's what people did. I mean, I went back for that second retirement. And even at that point, as, a senior enlisted leader, I still was questioning, how are my points going to work? So kind of talk about, if you're talking to a reservist, what kind of stuff should they be looking at and what can you help them go through?
Yeah. To your point, I think reserve retirement is one of the most complicated things you can try to venture down the road on. It is very nuanced. And going back to kind of same thing with active duty, I feel for a reservist, it's even more important to double check, triple check your documentation, your paperwork. One thing I try to, like, people that I do know or that I'm working with now, is check every year. Check your LES, check the documentation, the retirement points, documents that you get every year, and make sure they are correct. Make sure that your good years are counted, and your membership points are added appropriately, and you're not missing anything. Because again, if you hit 20 plus years and you hit that submit button and comes out, you're missing a couple hundred points for some reason. One, that's going to, significantly change your calculation. But two, you might not now have enough points to actually retire. And, now you got to figure out how to stick around for a few more years. So documentation, I think in that part, and reviewing that, whether that's on your own or with someone else, even in your unit, just to go through, hey, is this right? Is this what I'm supposed to be at? Do that first. But yeah, when it comes time to actually say, hey, I'm about a year out, I think I'm going to do this. What does this look like? And we can walk through some of those calculations and, put some of that into some of the estimators that exist. One thing I will say is we can do that as much as we want. And there is always that risk that whatever DFAS comes back with is going to be not what, you planned for. And so understand that there might be some variance in that, but also double checking like what they have to make sure that their documentation is correct. And again, I think a lot of this just comes back to, what are you keeping track of? And are you ensuring that everything is right?
I think too, with that, one of the big benefits that you will be able to provide to a lot of these people is the path, right? I always say there's plenty of information out there, but it's information overload. If you even put ChatGPT, you can end up with 20 different areas to go. So I feel like you would be able to give them the smoothest path to find the answers that they need and guide them through that. And with that, we talked, I was Navy, your Army. Is the core retirement the same? Names may be different, the way they do that. So if somebody's in the Navy Reserve, can they still come to you and it's the same, right? But it's just, you have the knowledge to get them through that in the right path. Am I wrong in that, or am I correct?
No, you're 100% correct. I think, like you said, some of the names might be different. The name of the system that you use might be different, but the crux of how the system works, how the retirement system works, and what you can expect is the same across the board. And to kind of hit on one of the other things you brought up, we can talk numbers all day long, and I might enjoy it. You probably won't, and that's okay. But you're right. Like the path and just understanding different things to think about and to work through. I really think that that's where the actual value comes from. The numbers are important, but I don't think they mean as much as ensuring that, you do things appropriately, and that at the end of the day, like, you're hitting the goals and objectives that you set out to at the beginning of this.
Sure. So first responders, military, we are constantly in that service, right? Whether you're in the military, and especially first responders and law enforcement, firefighters, we're serving others. One thing that I really feel like is, we maybe don't take care of those important people in our family. And specifically for me, spouse. My wife for the longest time wasn't really sure. I wasn't sure how to explain it. I thought it was all there. So do you sit down with member and spouse so they kind of get this picture? Because even now, retired, my wife's like, what happens if something happens to you? Which, by the way, Korey, you're not going to have a conversation about that with my wife, but including them, is that part of what you do when you sit down with these people?
Yeah, I highly recommend that if you are married or, engaged or whatever the case may be, where you have somebody else that is by your side, that you both participate in that process, because there are a lot of things to talk about. And I think, so one of the things that comes up is you have a military member or first responder that's working, and maybe the spouse isn't. Maybe they're working at home, taking care of kids, whatever the case may be. And sometimes there's a misunderstanding of how important that role is. And what if we reverse this? And what if something happens to them? How does that impact you as the military member, the first responder? It could be just as or even more significant than if something were to happen to you. So I really think that even from that standpoint, but also going through understanding, survivor benefits, whether or not that makes sense to do so, or if there's an alternative option that's, better for you depending on your situation, and understanding kind of just collectively all of the different benefits and what everyone is eligible for is something that's worthwhile to sit down and talk about.
Sure. And, I just comes to mind, one of the things I had to choose when I was retiring was survivor benefits. And honestly, it's such a quick section. And if you miss it, that's what I would fear. Again, this is the senior enlisted coming out. If I'm talking to my junior sailors, I'm going to like, when that time comes, there's going to be, it's almost like a flash of, do you want this or not? And, again, having conversations with you about that would be critical in terms of, me referring somebody to you, like you need to talk to them because there's so much going on. You're constantly going through and trying to get paperwork and documents. But I mean, that's how I remember it. Was that kind of survivor benefits what you've seen is just, it seemed like a flash. It was 2 boxes. And what does that mean? I mean, so survivor benefits, what would that mean to my spouse if something happens to me because I was fortunate to click the right box?
Yeah. I think in most pension systems, it's, 1 or 2 questions. And the most detailed you might get is there are some pension systems that have different percentage options that you can choose from. And depending on how that paperwork is set up, it may or may not even show you what that payout actually looks like. And so you might actually have to do that calculation to figure that out. But you're right. You're presented with all this paperwork. You're running through it. If you're not paying attention or you just kind of breeze over it, you might pick or miss something that you actually wanted to do. And again, part of that goes back to, there are some instances where it makes 100%, sense to hit yes and take the maximum that you can, and other instances where maybe it doesn't. And it goes back to, your specific situation. And that's why I do think it is worthwhile to talk through that. I was working with somebody not that long ago, and the difference between a 50% payout for their spouse versus 0 was like $45 a month. And so for them, it was like, well, this is a no-brainer, right? Like, why would I not want to cover my spouse? Because there's no way I can make that gap up. But for other people, maybe you want to do something else, or maybe there's some other thing that you're, strategy you're trying to do. Because there are other options. But if you don't think about it, pretty much like everything else regarding a pension, once you check that box and once you turn that in and submit it, there's no going back to fix it. It is what it is.
Yeah. And again, I think that's great for somebody that's thinking about it, is at least to have that conversation where you can help. Hey, here's kind of the stuff you're going to go through, because again, there's so much. And, I think about buying a house, or even worse, buying a car. When you're there and you're signing documents, it just becomes a free for all of, I'm not reading 600 pages of whatever. I'm trusting in that. But what you just said is, it's so important that you do it right the first time, because you cannot go back. And I think that was the scary part when I went through, and that's really what kind of made me think about it, was the small amount they took out was well worth that peace of mind. Again, there's tons of other things to do. There's life insurance, there's all kinds of stuff, but there's also that benefit that they get. And that's that prep, because yeah, it was just like a madhouse of trying to get stuff done and clicked and signed and turned in. And and again, as a reservist, the big nightmare is, I'm going to submit this and somebody's going to go, well, one of your years was a bad year or a non-qualifying year, and you only have 19 years of service. And now you have to try to, come back in the service, which as far as I know is nearly impossible. So yeah. So one thing that, again, I tend to try to think a lot, and this again is, this is senior chief inmate. This goes to somebody that maybe feels embarrassed that they haven't saved enough or started enough. What do you tell somebody in those situations where maybe there's a little bit of embarrassment? What would you say to them to make them feel a little bit more comfortable about having this conversation with you?
I think part of it is, being human, right? And understanding that, especially in, these communities, we do not get a lot of financial education. And I would say hardly any. I remember sitting in the police academy, and I remember 2 presentations that were back to back. And one was, hey, sign up for your deferred compensation. Make sure you put some money in there. If you want us to help you with it, check this box on the sheet. Great. And the next one was a bank that said, hey, if you guys need loans for all your toys, you want to get a boat, an RV, ATVs, call us up because we'll get you a great rate. Ever since then, I thought that was kind of hilarious in a bad way, because you look at it, like, these are two completely different aspects of finance, but really that was the only amount of, quote, education that I got in my career outside of stuff I did on my own. So I don't know that there's anything to feel embarrassed about. It is part of life. We all make choices about what's important to us. I think the biggest thing is when you realize that you don't think you're in the spot that you want to be. If you're willing to make changes and to actually sit down and have that conversation, that by itself is huge. And so again, it kind of goes back to what I said before, figuring out where you're at today. Maybe you're in a better spot than you think you are, and you just don't know it because you're not really sure what that means or what you're striving for. But I think making that decision to actively participate and to just get out there and kind of see where you're at and to be willing and open to make changes, good on you. Don't look back from that and just keep going.
Yeah. And again, we talk about first responders, police officers, the culture there. The last thing you're going to do is show some vulnerability or some weakness. But, my conversations with you, and I just wanted to put this out there, it's always, I feel comfortable. I feel like you understand that background. It's never judgmental. It's always presented with a heart of service. And again, that goes back to why we signed up and swore an oath the first time, is we wanted to protect and serve. So thank you for that. Now we're going to kind of lean towards some of the results of the podcast. And one of the big things I want to talk about is people listening to this and maybe seeing some of the reels that come out of it. What should someone listen for that would cause them to say, hey, you should call this guy Korey? What's something or a conversation that if I'm in a conversation with, a friend and they say something, what's some of those key phrases or something somebody would listen to that would be like, hey, that's probably a good person for me to connect with?
I think if you're at a point where someone is talking about retiring or wanting to retire within, 5 or so years, people that are talking about transitioning out, whether it's the military or law enforcement or, being a firefighter, trying to go do something else, any kind of career change really. And also, I would say it goes a little bit beyond that too. One of the things that I do like to say is that not everybody is trying to plan for retirement. There are other goals that people have. I want to be financially independent. I don't want to have to, worry about this job. I want to retire from, the military or law enforcement, and I just want to go do a job at Home Depot for, a few hours a week. Whatever the case may be, where someone is in a position where they're thinking about what's next, whether that's in 15 years or 2, I think it's a good time just to sit down and again, evaluate where you are and what your plan is to get there so that you have that idea, you have the roadmap, you know where you need to go.
Awesome. So when someone hears the name Korey Bowlby, what is one thing you would hope that they would remember or say?
Hopefully, you can get out of this that I do what I say, I'm trustworthy, but also that I understand your situation. Maybe I haven't lived your exact situation, but I've been in enough of it, been around it, have talked to enough people that there's a good chance that we can work through whatever the issue is that you have or whatever you're trying to plan for to actually make it a reality. And that really half of my job is to listen and just understand you, your family, what's important to you, and how to actually make sure that what I do is helping you achieve the different goals that you've set for yourself.
Outstanding. So for any of those people, military members, veterans, first responders, somebody that wants to start a conversation with you, what's the best way for them to reach you and how does that conversation start?
Yeah. So I'd say there's one of 3 ways, email, happy to receive emails from anybody, phone call to my office, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well. And any one of those will get back to me and we can set something up. I usually tend to say my first conversation with people is really just understanding what exactly it is that you're trying to achieve. What are the goals that you're setting for yourself? What are you planning for? And trying to determine whether or not I'm actually the right fit to help you out, because there's always a chance that I'm not. And if I'm not, I'm going to let you know that so that you also have some validation in terms of where you are, and maybe also provide you some resources that could help you if I'm not the right fit. And if I am, working through those situations, understanding your goals and objectives, and then, once we start working together, actually building a plan that fits for you and your family, whoever else is involved in making those decisions to get you to, that point that you want to go to, right? I often throw out retirement, but again, I don't think that it fits everybody's plan. And so there are different, goals and objectives to plan for.
And stuff that you would have conversations with somebody about, like, hey, they come find you and let's talk about everything, right? I mean, it's not just hyper focused on, I can get you through your retirement and what that means in pensions, but being able to then talk to them about bigger picture, right? I mean, financial planning is not only just that, it's what are we going to do and how to, make more money in the future. I mean, I think that's a goal, right? To have enough to keep growing it. So,
right. Yeah. And it goes, like you said, there's different things that we can touch on, from retirement to talking about what it's going to be like to buy a house, or how to plan through buying a house, or maybe you have a kid and you want to send them to school. What does that look like? Understanding your legacy, what you want to leave behind. Are you interested in having money left behind for your kids or someone else, or making, charitable donations and talking about insurance? I mean, there's so many different parts of it that I think so oftentimes is worthwhile to just sit down and have a conversation.
When you have these first meetings, and we're kind of getting to the end here, but is that a phone call? Is that a Zoom call? Is that in your office? Do you do visits? I mean, what are some of the options when people want to talk to you, and kind of how does that work?
I would say a little bit of all of that. So I'm able to, I'm in Tucson. So anybody that's in and around this area, happy to meet at my office, or also, out and about in town and around Tucson for the most part. But we can also talk on the phone. We can talk on Zoom. I think that the great part about technology now is that it doesn't matter where you are. As long as you have, phone connectivity or internet, we can talk and have that conversation.
Well, great. So just kind of wrapping up, Korey, really thank you so much for joining me today. One of the biggest lessons from today's conversation is that all these people, have valuable benefits, but it's not necessarily the same thing as having a plan. So we talked about that. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway is, there's benefits to being in the service or being a first responder, but you're able to give them a bigger picture of more than just what to do with that. It's what additionally they can do and how you can help plan them through that. You certainly understand the careers that we've talked about because you lived them. I'm going to say you still are living the reserve, and thank you for your service for that, but you're still in it. So it's not just, keeping up with, having to go do research. It's you're living that, especially in your position now. So you may have changed a lot of professions, and I said this earlier, but you're still serving. And really that was one of the key things I wanted to make sure is, you have that heart of service. You're helping to protect people in a different way now. Instead of being on patrol taking calls, you have the opportunity to, make an impact on somebody's life through a phone call or a Zoom call or, meeting at a coffee shop. So I think that's fantastic. So for everybody listening, remember, people can't work with you or refer you unless they clearly understand what you do. Korey, I think you helped us really see that today in who you help and the difference that you can make. So I appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you so much. And until next time, keep working on how you say it so they get it.